This was an unplanned video and the first time we've left the scheduled queue in a while, but I thought there were some topics we either didn't cover or didn't cover in sufficient details in the last few videos, which formed a loose trilogy, and were themselves meant to answer some questions we've been raising in other videos but had to skim past. There's also some channel updates this week, so while the material today is going to be presented in as reasonably complete and standalone fashion as possible, this is probably not the best video to begin with. If this is your first visit to the channel, and you probably have to click on the video link to go back to the original video in this set and start there. If you're sticking around anyway, you probably should turn on the closed caption subtitles, as my voice takes a bit of getting used to, and the subtitles help in the meantime. Okay, our two topics today, which are mostly unrelated but were both connected to our previous set of topics, are the Anthropic principle and superintelligence. The latter is our main focus, but I wanted to cover the Anthropic principle first, because while I've touched on it briefly in the recent videos, I didn't go into much detail because I didn't want to distract from the topics that descend from the Anthropic principle by sidetracking onto it. Mostly this is because the Anthropic principle is itself a fairly difficult concept to cover for a variety of reasons. First, it is a bit conceptually tricky. Second, the popular examples people use tend to really predispose people to a bias on it. And third, it is actually rather hazily defined as a concept. All of which makes for a lot of confusion, because people have a tendency to look for something incredibly deep and profound in the Anthropic principle, which I suppose there is, but much like its counterpart, the Copernican principle, or its more modern and generalized form, the mediocrity principle, it's really about how you look at problems when you don't know much and are encountering apparent improbabilities. For the Copernican principle, the example is how we are not the center of the universe, but there are three popular ones for the Anthropic principle. The first is the doomsday argument, which was created by the same fellow who coined the term Anthropic principle, cosmologist Brandon Carter, whose variation of the Anthropic principle is often called the weak Anthropic principle. The second is the simulation hypothesis, created by philosopher Nick Bostrom, who has done a lot of the work refining the Anthropic principle. And the third is the fine-tuned universe concept, popularized by cosmologists John Barrow and Frank Tipler in their book The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. These are great examples for increasing attention on the topic, since they may be summed up as basically arguing when the world will end, if we ourselves are real or simulations, and if there is a God. Needless to say, that captures attention, but it's almost guaranteed to upset folks and bias them on the subject. I prefer much more mundane and down-to-earth examples, but they can be a bit boring, and we covered two of these, the doomsday argument and the simulation hypothesis, as extensions of the Fermi paradox, so the Anthropic principle itself wasn't a main interest at that time. I was covering those topics in their own right, and in terms of how they fit inside the spectrum of proposed solutions to the Fermi paradox, not how they descend from the Anthropic principle. Also, as I mentioned, it's a bit of a hazy concept. Carter has said he regrets giving it that name. It's a bit misleading since anthropic means human-centered, and that's not the point. It might be better called the observer or egocentric principle in contrast to the mediocrity principle. On top of that, it was hazily defined initially, so many variants exist. Nick Bostrom says he cataloged 30 distinct variations, and many were really very off-concept. Since there is no official definition, I have the option of trying to present them all, or at least all the ones with semi-legitimate claims, which would be needlessly time-consuming, or just present what I view as the proper definition in the context we've been using it. So that is what I will do, and then we will move on to discuss superintelligence. We apply the mediocrity Anthropic principles all the time at a daily level without even thinking about it, but they're really about assumptions that should be drawn to make decisions when you don't know much. So the examples used tend to set up virtually no knowledge of the event, and neither view is necessarily going to produce different or more correct final assumptions. Here's two examples of them in mundane life, and in both I think you'll say, no duh, this is obvious. Example number 1. Standing in a room, I meet 20 people, and am informed of their jobs. 10 of them give me fairly broad random answers like policeman, or factory worker, or hotel maid, or bartender, and the like. But 10 of them tell me they are insurance salesmen. What should I conclude from this? Now, under either the mediocrity principle or anthropic principles, I have the option of assuming that I just happen to meet randomly with 10 insurance salesmen out of a sample of 20 with no underlying cause for the weird distribution. It isn't that uncommon of a job, after all. but they can also both contemplate that there was an underlying cause for the distribution. In fact, a bunch of you have probably already jumped ahead and concluded that I am probably at a hotel that is hosting a convention for insurance salesmen, and that I, the observer, might be one myself, thus simultaneously explaining the high distribution of insurance salesmen and my reason for being there to observe it. The mediocrity principle is mostly about realizing it is a convention, whereas the Anthropic principle is mostly about why I was there to observe it. Same if I noticed some room had 100 cans of corn in it. The mediocrity principle would be focused on places where we'd expect that, like a grocery store or survival bunker, while the Anthropic principle is about why I personally am observing this strange thing, because I'm grocery shopping or visiting a friend who is a survivalist. That's why I said it might be better called the egocentric principle instead of the Anthropic principle. Now, this doesn't seem like a terribly profound concept, and actually seems rather silly and trivial, something that seems that way for a lot of mathematical, philosophical, and scientific core concepts or assumptions. But it's when you're operating with very little information that it sticks out, because it comes down to decision making. So let's highlight that with example number 2. Example number 2. I have been handed many sheets of paper, each having a list of 10 movies on them, and the heading Favorite Films. Each of the lists is unique, but there are many similarities, and far too many for me to think it is very likely this represents a random distribution of films, or even popular films. How should I proceed? The mediocrity approach would be to look at those similarities, and to assume they are probably a random sample of a fairly mundane and mediocre nature from a group of people who wrote them, and that those folks represent a subset of humanity that is inclined to those films. The Anthropic approach would be to assume that my presence here to see those lists in the first place is indicative, and I would jot down my own list of 10 favorites, believing that it will help me draw conclusions. And depending on the actual circumstances, one of these approaches is more likely to be a good path. For instance, on this channel, I often get asked in the comments section what my favorite films or TV shows or books are, and no surprise when I list them I often get replies that many of those are their own favorites. And it is no surprise. I am a science fiction fan, and so is a lot of the audience, and that is very related to the channel. So my ability to observe those lists of favorites, or your ability to observe them now, is indeed very related to your existence. Alternatively, if we polled this channel for favorite foods, we wouldn't really expect to see abnormally high preferences in relation to the human population as a whole, though it might skew by geographic regions or other factors. To underscore it, these two concepts are not in opposition, and you use them all the time, but circumstances tend to dictate which is good for what, and reduce it to a simple and common mental exercise, and a bit of a boring one. When we know very little and pick topics like the end of the world, or if God exists, or if you might actually be a simulation on a computer, it can provoke deeper interest to contemplate the idea, but also tends to obscure what is both simple and profound as a tool for making decisions. To segue into our second and main topic for today, superintelligence, let me make a comparison to what is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect or curve. If we plot a person's confidence on a subject or problem against what they know about it, we get this sort of double hump. Initially, confidence is low but rises steeply, then drops off as they learn more before rising again. Now, I often call this first course top the peak of Mount Stupid, and it does seem to be a popular vacation spot, probably one we are all guilty of pitching our tent at on a regular basis. However, I raise it now to note more how we make decisions. Often, we can make a very confident decision off very little information, and grow less confident as we learn more, though eventually learn enough to be more confident in that decision. Sometimes learning more can even make us double-guess correct conclusions and make bad ones, but that's not my point here. I keep stressing that the Anthropic principle is mostly about decision-making when you don't know much, and it's about making a decision you can be confident about, not because you think it is very likely to be right, but rather because you think that, based on what you know, it was the best decision to make. If you get more info, you can revise, but in the meantime, you can decide and act knowing your decision was the right decision to make regardless of if it was wrong. If it's twice as likely to be right as the other options, it was the right pick, even if it was a tiny chance. If someone is about to roll a pair of dice and you have to guess the sum, you should say 7, not 2 or 12, and certainly not 1 or 100, since 7 is most likely, and 2 and 12 least likely, and 1 and 100 would seem to be impossible. If you later learn those were not 6-sided cubic dice, or aren't labeled 1 to 6, or that they are both weighted to land on 6s a lot, you revise accordingly. Now, the Dunning-Kruger curve is applicable to humans when we think about superintelligence too, because it's important to understand that we all hang out on Mount Stupid, because there's just only so much time in our lives to learn things, and only so much interest or need to encourage us to learn various topics. And those topics can include things like being a good conversationalist or a convincing speaker. Those are learned skills, same as throwing a ball or performing calculations. A superintelligence, of any of the 3 forms we'll be looking at, ought to have a lot more of those skills, and so as we approach these notions, it's a good idea to remove the fictional bias we have of thinking of some computer brain, or superhuman, as displaying all the personal charm of an ice cube tray. I mentioned this notion before in the Apocalypse How video, that in all probability an artificial intelligence bent on world domination is a lot less likely to do it with legions of killer robots and nukes, and probably a lot more likely to be swept into power by popular vote. Yes, it might use that it can be more impartial and knowledgeable as a selling point, but I would generally expect a superintelligence, regardless of its provenance, be it a computer mind or a transhuman, to absolutely ooze charisma and charm. But what is superintelligence? Well, Nick Bostrom breaks it into 3 loose categories, and I'll borrow his. Category 1. Speed superintelligence. Something we discussed before in the transhumanism video, essentially where the enhanced intelligence is simply in the form of thinking faster. This is often the easiest for people to visualize, since it is sort of like if the world around you simply slowed down. In computer terms, it's a faster processor. Category 2. Collective superintelligence. This is probably the type of superintelligence we're most familiar with, and sort of already have a type of, though it could vary from a very loose collective, like a tribe with specialized skill sets, scaling all the way up to a civilization, or a group of specialists advancing their field together, to more direct high-bandwidth collectives where you might argue there's only one mind, and the individuals are more like organs of a body or lobes of the group brain. In computer terms, this would be multiple processors or networked computers. Category 3, Quality superintelligence, our last category, is the hardest to visualize except by comparison, in that here we're not talking about adding faster processors or more processors in parallel, but in some way arguably more the software angle. A cat with a faster mind probably isn't going to discover calculus, nor would 100 cats all linked up in parallel. In human terms, one trained and talented scientist or artist is going to produce more insights or deeper art in their normal career than one random person who has 10 subjective lifetimes to look at the problem, or 10 random people put together in a room as a committee. Using that Dunning-Kruger effect one more time, we'd expect any of these 3 types to occupy Mount Stupid a lot less, since speed superintelligence has a lot more time to learn things in, subjectively, and can research topics in detail a lot faster. Collective superintelligence just has the 2 heads are better than 1 advantage, meaning talking to it would be akin to asking a room full of random people about something instead of just one random person. And quality superintelligence is akin to asking an expert rather than a random person. Now, as I said, we did talk about speed superintelligence back in the transhumanism video, and we'll just briefly mention the highlights of that and some new stuff relevant to it today. A speed superintelligence is basically when you're taking a human brain and speeding it up, either by miniaturizing it so signals move faster, or replacing existing biology with mechanisms that transmit faster. Human thought basically moves at the speed of sound or slower, whereas you could presumably ramp that all the way up to the speed of light, which is some millions of times faster. From a practical standpoint, you just live longer in a universe where time seems to be moving past much slower. Your subjective time is running way faster. You're not smarter, but you've got a lot more time to apply to comments or react to events or think about things. Of course, since your mind is wired to receive information from your eyes and ears and so on at a certain speed and bandwidth, you've got to modify that person rather extensively to be able to, for instance, mentally connect to the internet and be able to chat with other accelerated individuals by the equivalent of telepathy, presumably radio communications. And a lot of times we'd assume they'd abandon a natural body or use it as just one piece of their existence, since it will be too slow, even if we replace it with some cyborg chassis that can move at bullet speed. You'd sort of expect these folks would want to move in together too, since living in the same building with other accelerated individuals means no time lag on talking. And while we don't even notice the fraction of a second it takes for a signal to cross the planet, for them, even a phone call to someone in the next town over might feel like it would be for us trying to talk to astronauts on Mars, where there's several minutes of lag time after you say something before the other guy hears it, and just as much before you can get their response. We do carry on conversations with long lag by email, for instance, though. Often, even when we know we can dial the phone a lot faster than we can type the reply and get an instant answer, but it isn't the way we like to chat. Now, the second category, collective superintelligence, is in some ways something you're already familiar with. Group action effectively creates a new entity. Very literally, if we're talking about multicellular life or colony organisms or even hive minds, and more metaphorically if we're talking about teams or clubs or tribes or packs or hordes. You and I are both part of multiple collective superintelligences, albeit fairly primitive ones in this light. But groups and civilizations themselves are essentially big problem-solving entities. This is a very broad category then, since it can range from existing human groups exchanging thought by low bandwidth speech, up to something where we wired people's brains together so closely that they might be better thought of as being hemispheres or lobes of some larger brain. From the two heads are better than one approach to the full-blown hive mind, or even more integrated equivalents to a multicellular organism with only one meaningful personality and identity. And this would contain the idea of networked computer minds that explode into consciousness at some critical mass. Google gone sentient, as it were. Familiar concept, though I'd add a backwards case of this for contemplation before we move into the third category. We have all noted, in ourselves or in a friend, a tendency to wear different masks with different people or groups. Now that can indicate a certain amount of fakeness and fabrication to that person's identity, but I'm referring to the fairly mundane way many change behavior and even tone and mannerism around others. This can be a fairly deep transition too, and in more than just surface detail. It can verge on an almost mild equivalent to multiple personality disorder, and so I can imagine how an upgraded singular intelligence might actually break off fairly distinct bits to handle this or that task or interaction in a backwards case of collective intelligence or parallel processing. But it is more of a software than hardware approach, sort of multitasking, multiple windows open, but in a more distinct way, like when a computer's processor does the job of a sound or video card rather than having separate devices for that. Using that Google analogy, since we'd often expect AI to spring from something like a search engine that had a lot of interaction with tons of different users, I could imagine a huge AI that had tons of customized interfaces for dealing with certain user personalities, or even one unique one to each user. Now, speed superintelligence lets you think faster, and collective superintelligence lets you put more minds on a problem, and both are very handy things for problem solving. But we'd say there was a type of intelligence that handles some types in just a plain better way, in the way 10 people might take years or forever to figure out the answer to something when one person of the right mind can walk in and just figure it out with ease, or how one person might spend years trying to write a decent book and another could churn out a superior volume in a few weeks. This is a very hazy and indistinct type of intelligence, and we call it quality intelligence. And I would use the analogy that it's essentially a software thing, partially because I tend to be kind of dubious on the idea of genius to begin with. I regard intelligence levels among humans, as well as genius and talent, as mostly matters of development and focus, both in the software sense of experiences and knowledge, and a bit of a muscle analogy, that you've got to exercise the brain to build and keep all those neural connections. There are several competing theories for human intelligence. Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence that breaks it down into categories like spatial, linguistic, logical, mathematical, interpersonal, and a few other ones is a popular one. There's also Sternberg's triarchic intelligence, or successful intelligence, that breaks into analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. We've also got fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence that looks at fluid intelligence as someone's problem-solving skills independent of their knowledge, whereas crystallized intelligence is what handles skills and experience, and there are at least a dozen others. I am not personally aware of any of them being considered by the experts on this subject, as a strong lead candidate, and I suspect that besides us just not knowing enough yet, that we also need to mistrust some of the conclusions as possibly tainted by bias, both in the sense that the people doing the research are likely to assume they are intelligent, with good cause, but possible bias as a result, and the understandable tendency for us to want everyone to be intelligent in their own way. I have no idea how much either bias affects conclusions, hopefully minimally, but it certainly biases us non-experts, and we need to be cautious when thinking about quality intelligence to keep in mind that it might be in whole or part just things we could chalk up to faster processor or more processors, or more memory and knowledge and experience and better methodology or software developed in the process. You know, you might flick on some computer megabrain who could figure things out we couldn't even with more time or people thrown at the problem, and it might just turn around and explain its reasoning, and we slap ourselves on the forehead and go, that is so obvious, and can replicate that same feat of intellect, albeit slower or needing more heads involved. Or it might be we genuinely need our memories expanded so we could think about a lot more things at once. We're pretty good multitaskers, but there is an actual limit how many things we can think about or keep track of at once, and being able to tinker with that might be the single biggest improvement to intelligence from a quality perspective. Okay, that's where we'll wrap that up and move into the channel update. I've got the date up on the screen when I did this, so if that is a long while ago, or if you're brand new to the channel, you can probably jump ship here. If the latter, I suggest going back and watching that trio of recent vids I mentioned, and you can click on that box to go there right now, or you can try out these other video playlists. In terms of announcements, as the regular viewers know, I missed last week's video, got rather busy with other matters, but it broke our weekly schedule that I'd held to for 15 weeks straight. I'm rather surprised I went that long uninterrupted, and I've always said I didn't expect to keep up that pace, though I have no intent of returning to that once a month or even less frequent posting form before then. Part of the reason, though, was also that I've been kicking around changes to the channel. I mentioned some months back that I didn't really know where the channel was going, and I regret to say I still don't, especially in light of the wave of copyright claims I've been getting hit with, all of which so far I've won, but those have been getting more numerous and exhausting to deal with. So I've been pondering starting a website or changing the channel name to something besides my own, or asking for some help from the audience since there's a ton of skill kicking around the channel. And I've had quite a few generous offers to do everything from voiceovers to helping with the graphics to adminning a forum. And I haven't really figured out the right method yet. Heck, I still haven't figured out Reddit. I did, after some of the first copyright claims slapped ads onto my videos and I got tired of YouTube promising all sorts of new tools if I did so myself, put ads on the front of the videos. Those should just be little banner ads, and I always leave the lower third of the video fairly content-free to make room for the subtitles anyway. And there's also now a Patreon account for the channel, and I'll leave a link to that in the video description, but I'm still not entirely sure how to use that. Patreon suggests having rewards for patrons, but the only one I can think of is just offering to include them in the credits at the end, which normally just has me listed as the sole production credit, followed by the list of songs and artists used, so adding in the donors, assuming they want that, seems a pretty fair thing, and would fit in well if I start needing to add to those credits, to also thank folks who are volunteering art to use in the videos, or adminning a forum or whatever. Thing is, at the moment, I genuinely have no idea what the right path is, and researching it further just takes time away from making videos, not to mention answering questions and comments, which I not only consider a necessary and proper addition to the videos, but happens to be something I enjoy. I should probably add though that the sheer volume of questions that comes in these days, which will presumably only grow, is making it harder for me to reply to a lot of them, so while in the past I usually would answer the same question from someone else I'd already answered below, I'd encourage folks to scan those comments before asking, in case I've already answered it, or to reply to them and let them know I already had. That's another reason I'm pondering some sort of website or forum. I'd really like to be able to add FAQs onto these videos, or pin up diagrams or images contained in them, or that I wished added, or to be able to add in some quick follow-up that was less scripted and graphic intensive, B-sides as it were, if I felt something got left out or just wanted to go into more detail on something. I've also always wanted to encourage other people to try their hand at making videos. It's a wonderful medium with not too sharp of a learning curve, and I like the idea of being able to give people a bit of a jump start on that, or help some with useful production or art skills to hook up together on projects. I'd love to snatch a few individuals for myself, and doubtless will, but when you see talent, I think you've got an obligation to help them get their own projects rolling, not just lash them to your own and suck the energy out of them. But again, as I said, I'm not really sure what the best route on all this is, and since we've just been talking about collective intelligence, I'd greatly appreciate hearing some ideas down in the comments below. You can private message me if you prefer, but I'd rather mostly do it in the comments so that we can get group feedback. Plus, YouTube's internal private message system seems to either lose messages or delay notification, so it's almost easier just to look me up on Facebook. Though I should probably open up a separate FB account for the channel too. There's no Twitter. I probably should figure out how to use that as well. So again, at this time, I need ideas for what should be done as much as I need help actually doing any of it. If you've got some ideas or want to volunteer your time, let me know. We've got such a great community here that's been developing in recent months that I hate the idea of not doing something fun and interesting with it. Obviously, as things develop, I'll mention it in the videos for now. As with last time, I'm not sure if there will be a video next week or another skip, so I won't announce which will be up next or do a poll on that, but I'm still aiming for a primarily once-a-week production with releases on Fridays, and once I pick a direction and implement it, the pace should return to that. So that's it for now, hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.